In this video, I want to make one additional change to our program. I want to take this console log statement and extract it into a separate helper function. So that will allow us to leave this promise body right here a little bit more compact than it currently is. So to get started, I'm going to define a new function at the bottom of the file. I'm going to call it log to do. I'm going to set this up as an arrow function, and I'm going to say that when we call this function, we should take in the arguments ID, title, and completed. Now, if you see a little nasty underline right here, like a yellow or even a red underline, that's totally fine. Just stick with it for a moment. Once I define that function, I'm then going to cut and paste the console log inside there, like so. So now we can call that function from up here, and that will do our console log for us. So I'm going to call log to do, and I'll pass in the ID, that completed flag, and the title like so. Now, once again, if you're looking at this and you're thinking, Steven, you just made an error there, that's totally fine. Once again, just bear with me for a moment. So I'm not going to save this file, and I'm going to flip back over to my terminal, and let's try to run this once more. So I'll do a ts node index.ts, and my program runs, but if you look carefully, the console log is not quite right. So it says, has a title of false. Is it finished? Delectus aut autumn? Something's definitely off here. So what did we do wrong? Well, if I flip back over and look very carefully, you'll notice on my log to do function, I was expecting arguments in the order of ID, and then the title, and then completed. However, when I called the function, I passed in ID, then completed, and then title. So I clearly mixed up the order of arguments into the function. And once again, I got absolutely no information about the error that I just made until I actually executed my code at the terminal. So once again, here's the lesson about TypeScript. If we're not using TypeScript correctly, or if we're just writing out plain JavaScript, we don't find errors until we run our code, which is pretty inefficient from a developer perspective. So if we used TypeScript appropriately, we could have gotten a warning about this or some error inside of our editor before we ran our code, and that would have been a signal to you and me that we had to fix up something. So how are we going to fix this up? Well, I'm going to find my log to do function right here, and on each of these arguments, I'm going to add in a type annotation. So we've used that term several times so far. Remember, we're going to really clarify all these TypeScript topics in just a moment. So for right now, just bear with me. We're going to add in a little bit of TypeScript syntax here. So I'm going to say that this ID variable, whatever we pass in here, it has to be a number. And then our title, it has to be a string. Remember, that makes sense. Our title is going to be a string. And that completed flag, it has to be a Boolean, either true or false. So we've now written out ID, number, and then the same thing for the other two arguments as well. Now this is not creating an object or anything like that. Instead, we are trying to describe the type of variable that ID is going to be, the type of variable that title is going to be, and the same thing for completed as well. Now, as soon as I add that in, I can then see a red underline under the completed flag right here. And if I hover over it, it will tell me argument of type Boolean is not assignable to parameter of type string. So what this is telling me is that completed is supposed to be a Boolean, right? That's what this is. Completed is a Boolean. It is a true or false value. And I tried to pass it in as the second argument to the log to do function. But log to do says the second argument has to be a string. A Boolean is not a string, and that's why we are seeing this error. So once again, this is a notice to you and I as the developers that we're doing something incorrectly and we have to fix this up. So in this case, I would probably analyze this and say, oh, yeah, I just made a mistake in the order of arguments here. So I would flip the order around, like so, and then the error message goes away. And now I can save this file. I can flip back over to my terminal again, run the file once more, and now I'll see the correct result. All right, so that's it. Two quick examples of why we like to use TypeScript. We just saw two examples of extremely common errors, like people making typos on object properties that happens every day, probably thousands or even tens of thousands of times a day across the world with JavaScript. And we also saw an example of calling a function with the incorrect order of arguments, also an extremely common error. In both cases, we would have had to run our code to find these errors. But by using a tiny amount of TypeScript, we found these errors during development and we saved ourselves a lot of time. So we've now seen some very basic examples of why we like to use TypeScript. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to start working on our next application in the next video.